such an eventful moment.
Got it. Well, welcome. I see folks are starting to join both by Facebook Live and by Zoom. We're joined here today by Chevy Cook on aptly, today is Patriots Day in Boston, where Chevy's calling in from. And I'm thrilled, Chevy, thank you for doing this. Chevy is a new friend and a colleague in the mentoring world. In addition to being a major in the U.S. Army, he has been deployed many times, both during the surge and the Arab Spring and the fight against ISIS. He's worked in a variety of American embassies with local leaders, NGOs, and has also assisted foreign militaries, served in multiple special operations task forces. He's served many places abroad, is obviously a West Point USMA grad, but also got his master's from UTEP. You see his swag in the background there. Got his master's in organizational psych from Columbia and is now getting his PhD in human development from Tufts University. He also, and the way we are connected, is the executive director of Military Mentors. You see the other swag there on his chest, proudly wearing the Military Mentors logo. He's a visionary. He's an amazing leader. He is a scholar, a student, a great listener, somebody with incredible empathy and a great sense of leadership, and has developed his own expertise in Extremis Leadership and Mentorship, which we'll talk about today. But I don't want to overlook what I know is his pride and joy, which is his family. He's also the parent to 2 daughters, as am I. He's married to his high school sweetheart. Really, family, I know, is important to him above all else, so I don't want to overlook that in introducing Chevy. I'm thrilled you're here with me today. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks so much for such a wow intro. I really appreciate that. Every time I hear stuff like that, it sounds foreign. I don't, it sounds like it's kind of not me. But the part that sounds most like me is the part about family and about my connection to Ashley and London and Lola, who sustain any level of success I have is because they push me toward it. So thank you.
Great. Well, we're thrilled you're here. If you are joining us, please put any questions you have in the Q&A. As you know, if you were with us the past couple weeks, we will be monitoring that as well. Chevy, I want to start out by talking about this concept of in extremis leadership. What is it and why is it important right now?
So it's been defined in a couple of different ways, probably most famously by Tom Kolditz, who used to work at West Point many, many moons ago, and has his own institute now looking into leadership development. But I took some of his research and others and redefined it slightly in a way that I think is broadly applicable, especially at times like now. So very simply, it's leading when life, limb, eyesight, or livelihood is on the line. And we like to include the piece about livelihood because everyone on this call is not in the military. Many of us aren't serving high-risk warrants or kicking down the door when fire is erupting in a building. Many of us are just day-to-day people who enter a building and our CEOs are human resources personnel. So livelihood is important because that involves risk too. And in the presentation I've given before, I've related it to if you're a small business owner, for example, and you're going in to negotiate the merger or sale of your company and it doesn't happen, you then have to find a new level of work, or you have to hire a whole lot of people or fire a whole lot of people. In those situations, you better believe it's high risk. You better believe that livelihood is stressful and it puts you in an in extremis context.
So what does that mean for mentoring?
Specifically for mentoring, I think it means that folks need to recognize how they're trying to develop crisis leaders or leaders who can lead in extremis. And when they're mentoring those folks, trying to develop someone who can perform seamlessly in those arenas, they need to understand something that Kathy Cram was a champion of. The two functions of mentoring, which one is career and one is psychosocial. I would say as a mentor of an in extremis leader, or trying to build someone who can lead through crisis leadership, they need to focus a little bit more on the psychosocial aspects, right? Those aspects that enhance someone's competency, someone's feeling of closeness, someone's feeling of psychological trust. So focusing on those aspects during the mentoring process will then build, hopefully, people who can lead during critical times.
So how do you do it? How do you do that?
There's a couple different ways, but I would say
Yeah.
that one of the most important ways is creating crucible or developmental experiences that are similar or akin to the situation they're going to be in, right? The Center for Creative Leadership down in North Carolina will say that a developmental experience has three aspects. It has a component of assessment, it has a component of challenge, then it has a component of support. So putting people, developing people, mentoring people, putting them into developmental situations that assess where they are, give them an appropriate challenge, but then you support them through those developmental experiences is what builds people to become potentially a crisis leader or a leader who can lead during in extremis conditions. has put forth, military mentors, has put forth a model that talks about how to specifically do this. And we focus on 5 areas. 1, developing somebody's worldview. That's where it all starts. Your view, your perspective of what's happening is where your ability to lead starts. 2 critical components to that are self-awareness and social awareness. Do you know you? Can you lead self? And then you have some type of social awareness. Can you lead others? If you can't lead others through the crisis, I don't think you're a leader. The 4th and 5th aspects of these 5, worldview, self-awareness, social awareness, the 4th and 5th are having a sense, building someone's sense of agency or motivation, right? In certain crisis situations, you just don't have time to coddle anybody or push them on through. It's, hey, we need to react and react fast. The last component is self-regulation. I read an interesting book by Chris Welch that talked about cowardice because I wanted to see what the other end of it. If In Extremis is here, then I thought cowardice would be on the other end. Well, Chris Welch would actually say it's courage is in the middle. In Extremis leadership is in the middle. Cowardice is on the lower end. Recklessness, reckless abandon when you're trying to do too much is on the other end of the spectrum. So that sense of self-regulation, building someone's self-regulation through mentorship for these specific situations is very important.
Yeah, that's huge. There's so much I love about what you said, and including this idea of an effective leader, especially in this in extremis situation, has to have the self-awareness and the self-regulation. It's not just about helping others. You know, I read, as you and I know, we're both sort of voracious readers, and one of the things that came across my feed this morning was Jim Collins from Good to Great talking about the importance of the Stockdale Paradox right now.
Oh, yeah.
I know I can see by your nodding that you know what the Stockdale Paradox is. For those who don't, I can't remember what his rank was in the military, but Stockdale was in the Hanoi Hilton. He was an admiral, right? And he was in the Hanoi Hilton, and when they asked what helped people succeed, he said the people who didn't make it out were the optimists. And for me, as somebody who considers myself an optimist, I found that shocking. He said, no, it's this balance of realism and an unwavering faith that you're going to make it out okay. That is what helps people survive these extreme situations. And so I wonder if you have any thoughts or reactions to that, Chevy.
I do. I find it interesting that you came across that because I recently did as well. I have a friend and classmate from USPA by the name of TJ Root. He was a pilot in the 160th, which is the Special Operations Aviation Regiment. And I actually saw him do a pretty robust post the other day on LinkedIn about Admiral Stockdale and about balancing this idea of optimism versus realism and saying that it is critical during times like these, but really every day, if you think about it, we fluctuate in different types of crises throughout. You don't need a global pandemic. He was stressing the fact that Admiral Stockdale stressed the fact that you have to be realistic. Again, going back to some of those components I talked about earlier, being self-aware about what's actually happening and not just being, having rose-colored lenses on. Having that social awareness to have the realism that some around you are going to be pessimistic, and your ability to connect with them where they are is important. Again, building up a person's motivation around trying to be a little bit more intrinsically motivated than extrinsically motivated, or just understanding where they are, again, is important. So I think these kind of thoughts are extremely critical right now, but also beyond, right? You don't, balancing optimism with realism should happen more often than just in crisis, but practicing it during those times that you're not in crisis help you be this way when crisis does happen.
Yeah. You know, I do a ton of coaching, and I had a couple of clients over the last couple of weeks who are leading teams, and they're trying to figure out, how do I keep my team focused and productive and still acknowledge what's going on and help lead them through the crisis in a way that, to me, really embodies these principles of the Stockdale Paradox, right? Is this, you know, for lack of a better term, enemy before us, right? This
Right.
fear around the virus and all of that, because I don't think the enemy is the virus. I think the enemy is the fear around the virus and the uncertainty, right? Is to face that and then to really be able to push through. And I'm wondering, what would you say to somebody who came to you and said, how do I guide my team in this really difficult situation?
Well, interestingly enough, I would say you need to guide yourself first, or lead yourself first. It's a great book by Mike Irwin and Ray Kethledge that talks about leading yourself first. That's where I would start. Start with the self. Start with your own character and how you're approaching the day-to-day before you start to think about how to manage or lead your team. Because if you are putting on a false facade, especially through critical situations, people will see it even more. Okay, so I would start there. Start with leading yourself first. The second key piece I would probably give is to, like I've kind of a refrain that'll be here a couple of times, be socially aware, connect with those people authentically and meet them where they are. There's one thing to give your people a lot of work just to keep them busy. There's another way to give them work that will be focused, that will leverage their skills and traits on the team, that put them at a place to be most advantageous for everyone's success. That's why we come together as teams, right? It's about the collective synergy, 2 + 2 = 5 or better, to get the most out of our teams. So connecting with them and knowing where they are and being honestly open and authentic about whatever else may be going on in their lives outside of work, not just giving them the work to make them productive, but understanding where they are so they can do the work, is the second thing I would give. The last one here I would give is an idea about professionalism, okay? Right now, crisis situation, critical global pandemic, I think we err on the side of talking to your team about what it means to be a professional and what it means to be connected to your work and connected to others, to keep pushing forward, knowing that this is all going to end and there's going to be some new normal, and then we're going to come back together and we can rise from the fire, right? The phoenix came from the ashes. And I think there's a critical idea about professionalism that we sometimes overlook, that we probably need beforehand, but can come out of this as well. Gideon Rose in Foreign Affairs from CFR, he just wrote about this a couple of days ago. I actually have the Foreign Affairs around the corner. And he was talking about professionals being able to warn and plan while amateurs kind of scoff and ignore that. And then when crisis comes, by the time it arrives, all we're able to do is it's just too late. So we just kind of deal with it. So we don't want to breed that. We want to breed professionalism right now, to work through it all and have people focus on, hey, we're not going to deal with everything that's falling apart around us. We want to be the type of professionals that push beyond, that seek that self-excellence to get us all through.
Yeah, I love that. I love level setting about this expectation of professionalism. I think it's also super important as a mentor and as a leader to be able to say, what do you need from me as your leader or your mentor by way of assistance in order to, that might be standing in the way of you being able to be your best professional self right now too. So it's, to me, it's identifying that expectation, and then what are those blocks that you can kind of push through to get there. That's huge. That's huge. I just want to also invite folks to share any questions or comments or thoughts on any of these topics that you have. And then, you know, in terms of influencing our organizations, right? Because, you know, in many organizations, and maybe even for some folks who are watching this, we feel like we are able to push through and balance this optimism and this realism and lead our teams, but maybe our organizations don't have that same sort of foundation or orientation. How do we influence our organizations to help us get in this effective in extremis leadership mentality?
I think it starts with recognizing where your organization is. You know, a lot of organizations actually operate in crisis mode all the time. Right now, everything is on fire. You know, everything is a priority. Everything is urgent. So understanding the difference between what's urgent and important, and emphasizing that for organizations, getting a conversation about what's using the Eisenhower kind of paradigm of urgent being right now, today, in my email, and important being the beyond, the next horizon, the 90-day, the half a year, the year. Getting people around you in the organization to recognize whether what type of organization you are, an urgent, always urgent organization, or an important based organization is, I think, very important. So starting from there and then building either rapidly or over time, depending upon what the organization needs, going through the steps of the organizational change model, maybe using Cotter, for example, is, I think, critical. So knowing where you are and trying to move in that direction. And lastly, probably providing some semblance of a learning orientation, trying to build a learning orientation in your organization. Say like, look, we're always dealing with the urgent. Now it's time to really deal with the important, and taking the steps to get there as a leader in the organization. Regardless of where you are, you don't have to be the CEO to change the organizational culture, I truly believe. Mm-hmm. You can lead from any point in the organization, just knowing where you are and knowing how to influence up, down, left, and right is important. So I would say somewhere in there is assessing where you are, trying to get people to understand around you where you are, and then trying to figure out through organizational change how to get to that next level, try to get people around that learning orientation and change the culture that way.
Yeah, I love that. So let me flip the question just a little bit, which is, there's a lot of people who are still in organizations and trying to figure out how do we lead and deal with our organization during this time. And there's a lot of people who were in organizations until recently, but when we talk about livelihood being one of the components that's impacted by an extremist leadership, here we have a lot of people whose livelihoods have been, you know, either put on pause or changed, right? Mm-hmm. So when we think about how do we react to that, how do we have that self awareness and self-regulation when leadership or mentoring for us is in the context of a lost career or uncertainty about our professional future?
Wow, that's a heavy question.
Mm-hmm.
I think it starts with that self-awareness piece. So this is what I've learned from critical, difficult times or times of failure, times of crisis in my own military career, and from many greater leaders around me. We either shine or don't during failure. Everyone's eyes, when things go bad, turn to you, right? Mm-hmm. When you have your own missteps, when you are struggling, when you have lost your job and you may still need to leave, everyone will all of a sudden see what you do when the chips are down. So I think it's critical to recognize that. I think it's important to sit back, pull back, zoom out, and say, this is a moment that might be defining for me. This is a moment that I can either turn into a brick wall or a catapult. And recognize that in that moment, I'm going to turn it into a catapult. I'm going to be the leader maybe that I wasn't, or that got me to this place of tumult. And I'm going to springboard over what's laid in front of me. So I think that's where you start. I think it literally boils down to recognizing how critical it is to step away from failure with a resilience, a grit, a humility, an authenticity around, this is who I really am, broken. I'm losing my job. I don't have things aren't right. And being authentic with that around others. I think too often leaders just, they try to hide all of that. And then it just turns into something else, something messy, something inauthentic, that will creep back up the next time moments of failure arise.
Yeah, I love that. And it's funny, just as I asked you that question, Lori popped in with this question, which I think is overlapping. She said, the crisis for some mentees and mentors is uncertainty and fear, exactly what we were talking about. Less about getting COVID-19, but more about business loss and layoffs. How do you help people learn to manage through and with their fears? I think it's what Chevy said, but it's also this idea of acknowledging your own uncertainty and fear. I love this idea of zooming out and saying, is this going to be a brick wall or a catapult? That's really fantastic. Brenda just asked, is an always urgent organization a negative or just a current reality? Is always urgent the same as reactive?
I would say yes, in certain way. I guess yes to the latter portion, where urgent is always very reactive. I wouldn't say an always urgent organization is always negative, because guess what? If you're an EMT, emergency medical tech, you better believe that there's a lot of urgency, and they're not thinking about, lives next week. They're thinking about the lives that they're dealing with right there in their hands as they're trying to resuscitate someone's pulse. So I think it depends on where you work and where you sit within the organization, the work that you have. Now, to take it back to that same EMT situation, those people do got to think about the training that they have to do, right? The people they need to hire, because some people can't be an EMT up until their 70s or 80s, right? So there is an important aspect on the back end. So there are going to be some organizations that probably push urgent more to the forefront because it's what's needed. But you got to realize the important is always going to be there, whether you as a leader recognize it or not. So if you're in an organization that's always in the urgent phase, that's always in the reactive phase, know that what's behind the curtain is always lingering, and it will come upon you. So that's probably how I would answer Brenda, I believe.
Yeah, I love that. I think also there's a difference between reactive and responsive, right? And you can be in an urgency. You can have things that are always urgent as long as you have a process for response.
Yes.
Just as it's always difficult as somebody who's not in the leadership of one organization to judge what decisions organizations have made. But among my clients, where I see the disconnect the most when I'm coaching folks is when the leadership has done something that is reactive versus responsive, right? Immediately, to me, responsive is about communication. Reactive is about got to get something out. And this idea of weighing your response. Now, in these in extremis situations, to me, what is so awe-inspiring are the leaders who can be responsive in this moment's decision. Those are the times where you have to make those quick decisions. But when the time is not urgent, to be able to build those processes so that your quick decisions can be responsive, that rather than reactive, to me that's really the key.
Oh, I love the breakdown between reactive and responsive. Yeah. I also like the parallel that not just, members of the military in combat, but there's tons of people out there that can be responsive even when it's critically needed right now because we have some dangerous circumstance right there on the horizon in front of us. But that takes time to build. It takes a lot of time and a lot of, going back to an early part of our conversation, a lot of crucible experiences, a lot of developmental experiences to get somebody to the mindset where they can be responsive rather than reactive in the moment. But if you zoom back out and step out a second and realize that some of you out there aren't going to be in those really heady situations, guess what? You still need to build through developmental experiences, through mentorship, the ability to be responsive versus reactive, right? When someone brings you some bad news as a mentee, you can be reactive to what they're giving you, or you can be responsive. But it takes some time, again, in the moment, again, through leader development, through experience with others, through reading, reflection, etc., to get to the point where you can be responsive more often than not. I'm not going to say always because we don't deal in absolute, right?
Well, I think the other thing that occurs to me is, we spend a lot of time talking about trust building and mentoring relationships, right? And it is that taking the time to build the trust that has to happen before the urgency so that you can be able to have that processing and that vulnerability and that ability to move through the reaction into the response once you have that urgency. So that can't be overstated, right, about planting the seeds. And actually, I think one of the beauties of this time is we're all planting seeds for the future in making those connections and building those relationships. That to me is really, really exciting. So Chevy, I know you have a hard stop and a few minutes. I guess 2 questions for you. What is the one thing that you hope people walk away from this discussion knowing? And then 2, how can people find you if they want to find you?
So the first thing is recognize that it is interesting or debatable or pushy as it may sound. Recognize that what we're going through right now is a developmental experience. And if you're not taking the time to realize that you have a real life developmental crucible right now that you can maybe develop some others through, you can use the current circumstances to really put people in situations to grow a little something that they can use after this. I think we're kind of missing out on something right now. There's an opportunity right now to really, really hone and develop others' ability to lead through crisis because there's a given crisis. Many members of the military train to go overseas and do contingency operations or war or whatever it else may be. And we go to training scenarios that look like war, but it's never war. It's never combat. It's never that humanitarian assistance. You can't mimic it exactly. But here we are right slap in the middle of a real deal crisis where you can actually not mirror it. It's actually happening. So please try to develop the people that are around you and self so you can lead when this comes around again, because we all know history is a great repeater. The second thing about finding me, you can find, I am the only Chaveso cook on the planet, Chaveso. So you can Google me and that's me. So you can find me on LinkedIn or Facebook. I am a passive receiver on Twitter and Instagram, but I'm more active on LinkedIn and Facebook. And you can also find our website, Military Mentors, all one word, .org. And you can learn more about us and hopefully all about a little bit more about Lisa too, as she's on our board.
Wonderful. Thank you. You always have such an enthusiastic yes, and it's always such a gift. Thank you for your time and your insight. And we'll let you go for a class, but really appreciate you. Stay safe and healthy.
All right, y'all too. Take care now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, bye.